Welcome to the table, all you long timers and all you newcomers and everyone kind of in between. Yeah, welcome. So glad you could join us. So, like we had mentioned earlier, like Karen mentioned, tonight is a little bit unique in that I'm not gonna like do a monologue, a talk. Instead, we're gonna do kind of basically a panel discussion titled "Stress, Anxiety, Depression, and the Church." And obviously, we're in a really challenging time right now with the quarantine, and it's pushed many of us just into some really challenging places regarding our mental health. And so with that, we've been kind of in a series titled Tranquility, Cultivating Calm in a Crazy World, where we've been asking, like, how can we find this tranquility? How can we cultivate this? How can we draw on the resources and the wealth and spiritual practices and, in the scriptures and the Christian tradition to help connect us to the Spirit of God in the midst of this time and find some tranquility. So we've been doing that for like 8 weeks now. However, all things, that's a journey, that's a process. That's not a snap your fingers and suddenly like, oh, I'm glad I engaged this 8-week series. Problem solved. Of course not, which means many of us we continue to wrestle and struggle with this. Now you add on top of that the fact that kind of historically in the church, there's been some stigma with like mental health issues, almost this posture of maybe like at times almost a silence, like, hey, don't really bring that up at church. Or B, almost just some condemnation, like you just don't have faith or something. So kind of with that background in mind, the leadership team here at the table, we thought it might just be helpful if we drew together some different voices to have a panel discussion tonight. I think I've done far and away enough talking the last 8 weeks on this. So we wanted some other voices. And so these folks, they were chosen for a variety of reasons. I mean, because we trust them. The leadership team here at the table, we trust them. We think they're earnest seekers of truth. Also, they have like history and some experience in the church, and even many of them with either like depression or anxiety in even their own personal lives, so they can speak to that side of things. So yeah, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists tonight. So the first is Karen Leyva. And I'll do a short little intro, and then they'll introduce themselves more thoroughly in just a second. So Karen Leyva, Aaron Brown, there's Karen, and Aaron Brown, Maggie Porter, and Jacob Porter. 4 amazing people. And thank you all so much for joining us. So all right, there's like a variety of reasons. I think each panelist kind of has their like unique perspective and a thing to bring to this discussion. Karen she's super sharp, and she lives with a chronic illness, so she's no stranger to pain and mental stress and things. Aaron is both a pastor and a psychiatrist. Maggie has dealt with bouts of anxiety. And has done some really good work in learning to kind of work through that. Jacob, both he obviously he's or not, I shouldn't say obviously. So Jacob and Maggie, they're married. So he's in a relationship with someone who's struggling with these kinds of things, and he has kind of his own long journey with the church. And I'll let him share a little bit about that if he'd like. So he has sort of an insider-outsider perspective that I thought might be really helpful. So I'd like our panelists to go ahead and share just a little bit about themselves. I gave you the 10-second version. So y'all can, give us a few minutes on just a little bit about like where you're from, your connection to the table, why this topic matters to you. So let's go ahead and start with Karen, if that's okay.
Yes. First of all, English is not my first language, so be gentle and graceful. But I was born and raised in Guatemala in a very Christ-centered family. And so I had that beautiful background to help me go through a lot. And then 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and it just changed my life. I had to go from being someone who was very sharp and who prided herself for being intelligent and having education and pursuing these different degrees to someone who would fall asleep in front of the computer, who couldn't pick up a cup of coffee to my lips. And I just fell into this very dark hole, grieving who I used to be. There was just this profound loss. While I am not going to lie to you and tell you that, oh, I lost all my chances for marathons, because I was never that kind of person. I did feel like I lost a lot of who I was, and things that I thought were my identity. And that became just one of those things that I couldn't get out of. I mean, it's so hard for people without chronic illnesses to understand that the pain just envelops you, and that when you're in that kind of pain, it is late, days are very long. Seconds are amplified when you are feeling them through pain. So I had this view of tomorrow will be a good day, tomorrow will be a good day. But at the same time, I was so aware of the next 10 seconds, of the next 30 seconds, because I was in pain. So I think for me, that anxiety, depression thing, even though it did start before this, it got amplified a lot when I went through my diagnosis of a chronic illness.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Karen, for sharing. And let me, before we go on to Aaron's introduction, I just want to mention again that this whole discussion will be based around your questions, you audience-wise. So y'all go ahead and text your questions to Karen, or you can just drop them into the comments. And if you're on Facebook, and we can go ahead and ask them, you can ask them that way. So yeah, go ahead and chime in. So Aaron, can you share a little bit of your kind of story, background, why this is important to you, who you are, all that? Yeah.
Sure. I'm Aaron Brown. I grew up in Dallas. My dad is a pastor, so I've been around church life my whole life. He always encouraged me to absolutely not become a pastor, although I did. So I took a small trek to medical school first to become a psychiatrist. And I think that had a lot to do with wanting to deal with ministry. I got associated with these fine people from the table through my fiance, Lance, who has known them for a long time and absolutely loves them. We would still love to visit more, but we have church at 6:30 on Sunday nights. I'm the pastor at the Church of Texoma, and you guys are meeting at 5, so we can't make it like we want to, but through the power of media, here we are. And so I have some personal experience with anxiety, but more so just my experience working through and doing therapy and prescribing and working as a psychiatrist.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. Jacob, you want to go ahead and share?
Hey, yeah, Jacob. So Maggie and I, we live in Plano, but we've lived kind of all over. We first met all these wonderful people at the table back in Wiley. So then we moved off to Atlanta for a while, and then now we're back. So happy to be back. And just me personally, I don't know, these topics are important because I'm a human being. And so we all deal with these things at different times and various levels. So yeah.
Yeah, go for it, Maggie.
So I'm Maggie, and we used to go to, like Jacob said, to New Hope Lucas. And so I was very excited when we moved back to be able to connect with y'all again and to help y'all launch the table. I personally had never struggled with depression or anxiety until after I had our son, who's about to be 4. And I just grew up and how, we never talked about it, especially in church. It was never talked about. And so when I started having anxiety, a little bit when I was pregnant, but mostly after I had my son, it was very foreign to me, and it was very, very upsetting. And then I would say within the last couple of years, last 2 years, struggling with depression. but I am definitely, working through it. I think it's a work in progress. I never think, oh, it's you do something and you're healed. I think
Yeah.
it's a work in progress.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's go ahead and jump into some of our questions. So I know specifically Karen and Maggie, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but the question that someone wrote in was, for those of you who have struggled with anxiety or depression, would you be willing to share a little bit about your own journey with that and specifically how you dealt with it?
I think for me, the way that I deal with it today has changed so much, and that's okay. I think whenever is something new, you don't know how to react. One of the things that I noticed, for example, was that I really wanted to share how I felt, but there was a lot of self-guilt on not getting better. Because I kept sharing and sharing, and people, like well-meaning people that love me, would tell me, do you know that God loves you? And absolutely, I know that He loves me. Do you know that He can heal you? Yes, I definitely do know. And those things, I think that I was having trouble acknowledging it and then sharing it as well, because I had just that self-guilt. If I say it, then I am discrediting the power of Christ. And so it was just very hard for me to go through that. Things have changed. And of course, I've had a lot of, when you have a chronic illness, you have a lot of time for you by yourself, a lot of nights awake. And that has actually not been, it has really put me through a journey from where I was afraid, where had this big condemnation over my head that why am I feeling that way, to a place where now I notice that if I start from a point of view where I'm acknowledging the feeling, where I'm not trying to run away from it, where I'm not trying to battle, where I'm not in this constant war, but I know what it feels like. It's like I know it. I acknowledge it's there. And to me, once that happens, I can move on to things that I know. I did try the whole, you read the Bible and it talks about bring your thoughts of Christ, bringing everything to the obedience of Christ. And it has all these things about action. And I could not, I could barely think. And so I couldn't go into this action warfare, spiritual stuff. I just couldn't do it. So for me, the being still, just the listening, the being present was such a big deal. I kept reading. Paul talks about, the Apostle Paul talks about having a thorn, and I have this amazing cousin who has truly not only supported me but has like single-handedly me just get me out of that hole. And it talks about how he 3 times asked for God to remove that thorn from him, and instead he said, "My grace is enough." And I think everyone grasps a certain thing, but my grace is enough has been it for me. There's such freedom on grace. There's such freedom in the sense that I can reach out, that I'm not judged, that I am loved, that I am feeling like I'm in a hole today, but that doesn't make me less faithful. And one of the things that has also really resonated with me is, if I accept that grace is enough, that grace has completely freed me from the judgment, then I also need to give that to myself. How much grace am I giving myself? So I think it is, for me, the word, I think everyone has a thing that touches them, but for me, in those times of complete darkness, it is grace that gets me through it. So that's my particular way that it has really morphed from a place of full condemnation to a place of where I can accept and be open to grace.
Yeah, I can definitely feel and agree with that. I have also felt like shame for having anxiety or depression. Like, why am I not enough to not have these things? And I want to answer Norma's question. What is the best way for those of us who do not struggle with anxiety or depression to walk alongside, love, support someone who does? Just being there. I feel like the past few years, Jacob and my close family and friends have just been, not even like, said a whole lot, but that just the fact that like, him and them have just been there when I have been upset or down, and not necessarily saying like, oh, everything's gonna be okay, like, oh, you should read your Bible more, like nothing like that, but just like it's okay to feel your feelings and this too shall pass. Especially when I have had like panic attacks, just hugging me and just helping me count and breathe while that passes. And then if I have had like bouts of depression, then just to, like, Jacob will just remind me that like it's okay, like that this is not going to last forever and there's nothing wrong with me.
Wow. That's powerfully put. Thank you, Maggie and Karen. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that, either Aaron or Jacob or anyone else, before we keep moving?
My goodness, I don't like. One thought that I had was, as far as like being supporting someone who's dealing with this stuff. I know that I definitely. So when we're talking about like stress, anxiety, and depression, like those three words, I think kind of get tossed around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to diminish anyone's experience, because we all deal with stress and anxiety and sadness, but there's even another level of it, right? That's like I don't know, clinical, to where it's like it's real. It's a whole nother experience. And one huge thing that I think really helped our relationship when you started dealing with a lot of this stuff was like one of the reasons that we moved back was that I was working in Atlanta, and I was commuting basically at least 2 hours a day in the car. And over the 2 years of doing that, I started developing like actual physical panic attacks as well, like in the car. And then it was like, oh, this is what this is, because Maggie has been talking about this stuff, and I never knew what she was talking about. So it's like it's really real. So like if someone that you love is like talking about dealing with anxiety and like panic attacks specifically, it's a very scary feeling. Like you feel like you're going to die, right? It's and it's not really logical, and so there isn't really a whole lot to I don't know, do about it, except like Maggie said, like just be there and like reassurance and like that kind of thing. So one thing that I would just say, I guess all of that wrapped up, is that like give yourself a little grace, and realize that like these things that we're dealing with are powerful and they're difficult, and there's not really a lot of answers, right? So we're all figuring it out.
Yeah, there's that word grace again, and yeah, it seems like a big deal. Aaron, did you have something?
I mean, I think they're all talking about what people tend to feel, which is just kind of this shame for being weak or for having mental illness. It's really common. Working in a nursing home now, it's hilarious because I walk in the room and I go, have you ever had depression or anxiety? And they're like, no, never. Like, because there's just a shame associated with it. And I look at their med list and there's like Prozac, Zoloft, Xanax. It's like, oh, they've had problems with depression and anxiety. But we compound it by adding the shame onto it. So I think all three of y'all have said it. Like, once you learn to be okay with what you feel, it didn't make all of the anxiety and depression go away, but like you at least didn't have this compounded emotion of shame on top.
Yep. Something Raymond kind of just chimed in with a little bit ago in the comments was, could Aaron talk about like therapy and medication? And I'm kind of assuming he's speaking to maybe the question of, at what point should someone pursue that, or, what's run of the mill anxiety or depression that'll kind of, maybe take care of itself over time versus something more like, oh, that's something you need, to seek professional help over. Do you have any input there?
Yeah, I'd say at the point that you want to. At the point that it bothers you enough, at the point where you're not happy with the way that you're living, that's the point where you start seeking help. So that's going to be at different places for different people, just like it is physically. One person hurts their arm and they don't even think to go to the doctor, and the next person does. It's the same with mental illness. At the point where it disturbs you, it hurts your relationships, it hurts you at work, or you just don't feel as happy with your life as you want to. That's the point at which you get help.
Yeah, that's great. This has been kind of alluded to a little bit, but I wondered if you all, I think it was really Karen who gave a little bit of an example of how the church kind of factored into her experience. I was wondering maybe if you all could speak a little bit to that, like how have you seen the church kind of, I guess, interact with either you or others kind of, who are struggling with like mental illness, and then, and that could be good or bad, but what's been your experience? And yeah, unpack that. And then we can maybe get into how should the church do better potentially. I'm presuming all your stories won't be, it was perfection. Oh my gosh, everyone just, so anyway, yeah, could you speak to that kind of first part? Anyone that wants to chime in.
I think for me, there's the stigma and the fear that comes from the acknowledgement of mental health is very palpable in the Christian part of things, or at least that was my experience. One of the things that I like about talking today is that it takes away the stigma, and it just that conversation helps you get away from that. But for me, I know that for my mom, it hurt her heart when I try to talk about depression, because she started calling my pastor, elders, because she just tried to just get me out of that hole. And so then they call me and they prayed, and I love that. But then I feel pressure next time when they're like, how you doing? And I have to say, I'm better, because otherwise, if I don't do that, I am not. It's like, if I'm broken, then it means that Christ is broken. And so there's this thing that you can't really acknowledge it.
That's good.
And so that, that example that we have to the world and that fulfillment of life, and I wasn't representing that. So for me, it was really hard to acknowledge that part. And I started thinking about how I have this really good support group for 8 women, and none of them are Christian. And so to me, I kept going back to that. I'm like, why am I getting so much support from them? And one of the things I noticed that I was getting from them that I wasn't getting from my Christian community was that they acknowledge how I felt. They gave it a name. It wasn't something you run away. It wasn't something you just pray away either. It was something that, yes, prayer supports. Companionship support is there. But one thing that I love was that they, to this day, ask me, how can I support you? And my husband, for example, goes into problem-solving mode. Fix it, fix it, fix it, fix it. And I understand what he wants to do, but that's not what I need. So Maggie was talking about, she needs to be held. I need to be left alone. Do not touch me. Do not talk to me. It's very big. So just finding that support, someone that can listen to you, that can acknowledge you, that doesn't see you for the church, that doesn't see my brokenness as a reflection that I don't have enough faith, or that Christ is broken, and it truly isn't. The whole idea of how has my faith playing in, and they're like, do you have enough faith? It is my faith that has sustained you, that has kept me here. I don't know where I would be without. I don't know if I would be here today without that faith. And my struggle does not deny my faith, and that is a huge thing that I've struggled with. with just the whole experience that I've had with church.
Yeah, Karen, I think the irony is like our main symbol as Christians is a cross, but we struggle with the idea of suffering. Like, so it shouldn't be like I always have to present this wonderful picture to the world because that's how I represent Christ. Like, Christ came in suffering for us.
Yes.
So sometimes even our suffering is true identification with Christ, like not the opposite.
Beautifully put. Anyone else want to chime in on that? Or on anything that was said? Karen, what Karen said? If not, I got questions. So I'll keep going. All right, so the Bible, it speaks about having like joy and peace, because we have a relationship with God. But what do you do when you don't have that joy and peace in your heart? Is that a sign of there's a number of questions here. So A, what do you do when you don't have joy and peace in your heart? Is that a sign of some sort of unfaithfulness to God? I think Karen spoke a little bit to this earlier. Why do others seem to have a joy when I don't? Again, is this something to do with me? So kind of the two, there's a lot going on there, but I can hear what do I do when I'm reading the Bible, but I don't seem to have that joy and peace in my heart? Is that a sign of some sort of wrongness in me or unfaithfulness to God? Could y'all speak to that?
Oh, I enjoy this one. I just did a sermon on it. We were actually talking about sin, and I talked about how multifaceted it is, and it's the same with this. Like, we are born with different temperaments. We're born with different biological factors. Like, we found out that a higher population of people in prison have an extra Y chromosome. It tends to make them more aggressive and things like that. So sometimes you're feeling aggressive, angry, and there are genetic, biological, temperamental factors that all play in, and it has nothing to do with your relationship with God. And then I would say at the same time, I think there are a lot of things we can do that are still helpful. Like I've seen you do a sermon on spiritual disciplines, and there are all sorts of things that help us become more aware of the presence of God. I would say that you're never out of God's presence. In the Psalms, it talks about even if I go, He's there. It's not like I can escape the presence of God. So you haven't done anything to make God go away because God is so big that there's no place for Him to go. But there are things that keep us from being fully aware of God's presence. And spiritual disciplines and all those other things help. But we can't ignore all the other biological and temperamental factors and make it just spiritual.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know that was a hypothetical question, but if someone was really asking that, it's like, why don't you put down the Bible and go do something that you want to do, right? Listen to your body. We're I don't know, one of the biggest things that has, especially the past couple months, getting through all this, social distancing and staying in the house all day, is finding some hobbies. And I don't know, it really helps me. Maggie's not quite as much of a hobby person. But for me,
I'm trying.
I know. But for me, it's okay, well, sitting around and praying and, meditating all day, that's not going to fulfill me. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with your whole day not being centered around spirituality, experience things, find pleasure. That's one of the huge things that I have a problem with. Some of the way that church typically is I don't know, practiced or taught, the teachings in the church, at least in this country, is the denial of self and purity culture and everything that's wrapped up in that. And it's I don't know, there's nothing wrong with experiencing things as a human being and finding pleasure in life. So I don't know.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you. Anyone else before we keep on moving? Okay. So Norma chimed in asking, is there ever a situation where you could be like enabling someone in their stress, anxiety, depression? And so what does it look like to help, but also be, I'm kind of thinking maybe, Norma, you can chime in the comments if I'm kind of misreading this, but like maybe where someone's sinking into kind of like an isolation or something, and you you want to maybe help, but you don't, but without perpetuate it. Like maybe in essence, someone's kind of going into a bad place, but you don't want to be pushy or anything, or you don't want to be unhelpful, so you just kind of let them go into a bad place, but you're like, how do I walk this line? Maybe where I don't want to be pushy, but I think they might be, something extreme. Like, what if they hurt themselves or what, whatever. Anyway, I think that might be the question behind the question. You can, okay, she says yes, so I'll go with that. So anyway, yeah, any thoughts on some of that? Like what if someone's in that place?
I want to set Karen up because I thought she answered it earlier. Like, she said she went to a group and they asked her, what do you need? Like, they didn't make assumptions about what she needed. Like, they just asked her. And then Maggie, I see you nodding. Like, was that your experience too?
A little bit. I think it was a lot of, Jacob, because we're together all the time, being a little too much together these days. Being like, him just kind of being open, like nobody being defensive, like if you are someone who doesn't deal with it and then you have someone in your life who does, and then being like, this is how I feel, like Jacob is never like, well, you shouldn't feel like that. Like, why are you feeling like that? You have such a great life. But just being like, oh, that's actually feel like that right now. Being like, what can I do for you? That group sounds really awesome, Karen. Just, how can I pray for you? Like, do you want me to send you funny quotes every day? Like, do you want us to talk a few times a week on the phone just about life? Do you want us to not talk about it at all while you process it? I think but not denying, like not ignoring their pain and their anxiety and depression, not being like, and not acting like that it's not real, because it is very real.
Yeah.
I think just to add to that, for me, and this is an I statement, my personal opinion, my experience has been that I have this cousin who's like a sister to me. And I don't know how this woman hasn't gotten tired of checking up on me, because there's times I got anxiety talking on the phone. And so she calls me and she knows that there's days that I can't talk, and I'll text her. But just a constant check-in, making sure you're okay. She doesn't tell me what to do. She calls me and tells me how you're doing. Hey, she sometimes tells me, hey, I'm just calling to remind you, you are the righteousness of God, that you are the chosen one, your holy nation. I mean, this woman just tells me, just reminds me of things that sometimes my head is telling me otherwise. It's just a voice. And I do feel that at some point we go through this grieving process, and it's hard sometimes to look for help or how we can voice help. But I do personally feel like there is a point where it becomes a personal choice how we are going to seek help, that we do have autonomy on that. And that for me to realize that I needed to go seek that help. I mean, that's something that my husband could not have made me do. It had to do with me searching for it. It was affecting not only my job, like we talk about the brain fog, but it also affected my relationship with my own child. I have an only daughter, and my ability to be present. So at that point, it does become more than like support, but also encouragement to look for help, to what have you did this therapy work. And I don't have any stigma on saying, you know, I had to search for therapy and I had to search for meds and I had to have this thing that would move me forward. So I think a lot of times we worry that we are not helping our loved ones who have anxiety and that we are indulging them in their anxiety. And while I completely think that's how many people will feel, I think that checking up on them, being that person doesn't give up on them, or just that resonating message of who they are helps. But I do think that at some point it is up to the person who is going through this to seek help and find out, what can I do? But that's my opinion. Again, my I statement.
Well put. Any follow-ups there from anyone, or before I keep moving? Okay. So this next one, it says, I hear a lot of isolation causes stress and anxiety, which can lead to depression, which then cycles back to increased isolation. What are some healthy ways I can cope with this cycle? So it sounds like someone who kind of finds themselves isolating, experiencing anxiety, depression, which kind of makes them distance more, which then, it's this kind of vicious circle. Any reflections?
I think the whole depression part of it is a cycle. The whole anxiety, and it's one of those things that you feel bad because you're not interacting with your friends. You feel like you are being a bad friend, a bad mom, and then that just makes things worse. And you go all around and it just seems like you can't get out of it. Isolation is a big part, and we're living it right now. Mm-hmm. And it's really, to me, it's just very in my face that that support that I would usually find. I take a lot of joy in my job and interacting with my coworkers. And then I work for a school district, so interacting with my students, and that's not there. And that has been such a huge empty spot for me. So I've had to connect in other ways. Online, thank goodness we have that. Honestly, the text that I get from Pastor Brett for any type of connection to me means so much more now. We've done happy hours with my friends online where we can just sit there and talk, connecting with people for example, I have an online community for people with RA. That helps out a lot as well. Finding just support, people around you. Don't be afraid to reach out. I think you would be amazed at how many people are going through the same thing you're going, or feeling isolated. And I think we tend to think it's only us. And then you talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, I didn't know people who had anxiety when talking on the phone. That was like new to me. And they're like, oh yeah, I avoid phone calls. But I think that's the beautiful thing of reaching out, and just getting past that point where you're just so consumed by the loneliness and by the isolation. When this thing came out and they were going over who was more vulnerable, and they're talking about immunosuppressed, I was like, okay. Asthma, I'm like, Then they say obesity, and I'm like, listen, we're not gonna go through this. But it became this big thing. Like, am I gonna die? It just became really real. And I went into that portion. It was just dark, and for sure, this is what's gonna kill me. And it just so for me to find support, to talk it out, to find someone that was, will listen to you. If you're afraid, we're gonna validate you. That to me also had to do with finding, again, that support group. I feel like the support idea, it's mentioned and people hear it a lot, but it truly is, or at least for me, is what gets me through this isolation, which can be very dark.
Yeah.
I would say I've definitely felt more, it's gotten better the last couple of weeks, but just the past like 8 or 9 weeks of quarantine, the first week and a half was pretty okay, but I felt like I was starting to be really down for a few weeks and was really depressed. I think a lot of it was mom guilt from, Sam being home all the time, but then I now, as opposed to when he was going to preschool 3 days a week, and then having the cycle of, well, I feel depressed, so I don't feel like, I don't feel totally present. I don't feel like I can just enjoy him and play with him all day. Then I feel guilty about that. And so but I've been trying to really, just if the mom guilt thoughts come in, just to let them go. And I would say the last 2 weeks I've done really well about that, about just kind of letting it go and be like, I have a great kid, I'm a great mom. I'm pretty bad about speaking like positive thoughts to myself, because I'm not that I think I'm terrible, but it's easier to speak things to other people, like to tell Jacob and Sam they're so great and amazing, than it is to tell myself. So I think that cycle is not very helpful, but I'm trying to get out of that negative cycle.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a quick technique that helps with that is finding one person who you really trust while you're feeling good, and you give them permission to be the one to tell you if you need to get back out. Because we all do kind of need our alone time and those things, and it's hard to judge when you've crossed the line from that and just pure isolation that's going to lead to more depression. It's really hard to tell when you're in the middle of it. And so while you're feeling good, you tell that one person, I will trust you. And if you say, I've been at home too much, or I'm not getting enough social contact, then we will do something about it on the spot. But just give one person the trust to speak into your life in that way.
That's a great handle, because I think that's something I've heard as y'all have been talking, is on the one hand, having a bunch of people kind of come at us like, hey, you're not doing this well, and you're not, is like really unhelpful. But on the other hand, like we can get in that isolated place. And so it's like, and so I love that. That's a great insight of, okay, who's that one person you trust that knows you well and that knows how to do it in a sensitive, loving way, but who can be honest with you too. That's really well put. And it kind of, our time's kind of starting to come to a close. But one of the key kind of takeaways, two takeaways I've heard from this, or I'm taking kind of from this conversation, is in terms of how we can help, how we can be there for others who are in experiencing these kind of intense, challenging emotions, is the idea of asking the question, how can I be there? What do you need? What would you like from me? I thought that's really helpful. And as well as something Karen, I think, mentioned this, although so did Maggie in a way when she was describing Jacob and their relational dynamic, is the idea of presence, of just being there for someone. I wondered kind of in closing how, if it's either emphasizing those or other ways, like how can we as the church, as folks in community with others, how can we do better on this? Moving forward, what can we change? How can we do better?
Woohoo. Okay, here's my kind of controversial hot take. I think actually where the church has had problems is we've overstepped. Like we haven't been trained in mental illness. We haven't been trained in anxiety. So I think we're trying to take what we learned about spirituality and we're applying it too broadly. So in Matthew 6, where Jesus talks about not being anxious, I guarantee you he did not have generalized anxiety disorder or PTSD in mind. But we've taken like this passage and applied it broadly to things that weren't even happening in Jesus' day. So I think one of the best things we can do as a church is stick to what we know, like help people spiritually. And there's a spiritual component to mental illness that I think the church could be very helpful with. Most psychiatrists and therapists are going to ask about your spirituality during a session because it is a part. But we have people who are trained in dealing with the biological part and the psychological part. And just like we would do with cancer, we should probably just say, I love you, I'll pray for you, what do you need? But here are the people who can help. And then I think the church can also be very beneficial in dealing with shame. I think depression and anxiety both have a huge basis in feelings of shame. And for people who grew up in church, so much of their experience was shame-based and fear-based. And so again, that spiritual component of it is a thing that the church could address. Like, how do we go back and teach the gospel in a way that's about God's unconditional love and God's total presence with you, and not your total depravity and how terrible you are, which of course is shame-based. So how can the church change that rhetoric in a way that we show people that they're already loved by God and loved infinitely and unconditionally? I think that would at least help with the spiritual component of anxiety, but it would still be there, and we need to refer to people who can help.
Yeah. Thank you. Karen, Maggie, or Jacob, have any final thoughts on this topic, this question of how the church can do better?
I think just talking about it, like the fact that we're here, talking about it, acknowledging it, that's, in my experience, something that I have not experienced through church before. And to understand it as not a state of mind that you see, it's not that you're having a bad day. Like Aaron mentioned, it's something that is pervasive and will have an impact on you, and to acknowledge that just as you would another type of sickness or disease. And I feel like that helps out a lot. And talking about it brings awareness. It also brings to where I don't feel like I'm the only one. I don't feel like I'm odd either. So to me, that is the biggest thing. Let's start with talking about it, with validating that it exists, that it affects a lot of people, and that it affects people different ways. I think small groups, any of that kind of stuff that we would have to, I keep talking about support group, but I also understand that I'm in a very privileged position to say my family does this, my friends do this, and not everyone would have that big advantage. And so I think that's where church could come in with providing that support if that person feels welcome and accepted by that group.
Yeah, I was going to say just the fact that we're even opening up this conversation. I think that I thought that was great. When I read your email, I was like, that is very good. I think it gives people, or like when I hear about other people who deal with depression, anxiety, it almost like I'm like, oh, thank God I'm not the only one, like, even I know there are so many of us who struggle with it, it's just like a breath of fresh air just to remember that you're not alone.
Yeah, one of the biggest things for me, pretty much the only thing for me right now, is the church provides us community. And so to me, that's one of the biggest things that we keep touching on, is needing relationship, because like we're not meant to be doing this thing by ourselves, right? And whether that's just one or two relationships or many relationships, the church is kind of one of those common ground places that we should be able to come to and have a safe space. And unfortunately, it hasn't always been that way. But like Aaron was saying, like, just have to stop pushing the shame and start teaching people about their inherent worth and their goodness. And hopefully we can start rewriting some of that. So.
Yeah.
And when Karen just commented, Karen Miner just said, church is not a substitute for professional therapy. Amen. I like my therapist.
Yes. Yeah. And anyone who's done any counseling with me knows I will meet with you twice and then make a referral. So,
well done.
Yes. And well, thank you, Karen and Aaron, Maggie, Jacob. I'm so grateful. Thank you for like opening up your own lives and heart. And Aaron, I know you have like church stuff today and other things going on. So thank you for just taking the time to love on our community and share. I'm really, really grateful. So if we were all like together, everyone would say, give them a round of applause. Come on, everybody. Woo! And everyone would like stand to their feet. They're like, oh my gosh, it was amazing. We're online though, so it'll just be real quiet. But I know they're saying, like, they'll probably leave comments and things. Like they'll say like, we love you. So anyway, Thank y'all so much. I'm going to go ahead and pray, and then we're going to have a closing song. So panelists, if you want, you can stay on for my prayer, but you can also just leave. So either way is fine. So I love y'all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lord Jesus, we just thank you for this time and this conversation. God, I pray that it's opened eyes and hearts and minds, and whatever truth was spoken, God, and was really heard by someone, I pray it would go deep, God, deep into their heart and mind, and that they would find the support, the love, the insight, the courage that they need, the healing that they need. Lord, and may the table, may we be a church community that loves well. And we know we won't get it perfect, but help us to love well, Lord. So we give you this night, this time, this conversation. In the name of Christ, I pray. Amen.